Breaking news. The Wisconsin Supreme Court issues a blockbuster ruling and hands vote suppressors a big loss. Welcome back to Democracy Docket. I'm Marc Elias.
And I'm Paige Moskowitz. Let's get started.
You know, Paige, there's not a lot of good court news to celebrate these days, it doesn't feel like, but a big victory for voting rights in the state of Wisconsin. In a 4-3 decision, the Wisconsin Supreme Court rejected an effort by vote suppressors to make it harder for people in that state to vote.
This case started in 2022 when the election clerk of Racine, Wisconsin, created a mobile voting van that was driven around the city, acting as a mobile absentee voting site to meet voters where they were in their neighborhoods, to make voting access easier. And of course, a right-wing group called the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty filed a lawsuit claiming that that van was illegal and that cities have limited power when it comes to establishing absentee voting sites.
Yeah, and this was a big case. You know, my law firm got involved. We intervened on behalf of the Wisconsin Alliance for Retired Americans to fight against this effort. And as you say, this case has been going on for a couple of years and has had different twists and turns in it. But throughout the whole thing, you know, the Republican Party filed amicus briefs on the other side. It has been clear that Republicans have wanted to make it harder to vote. They've tried to make it harder to vote throughout the country. They tried to make it harder to vote in Wisconsin. In this case, they tried through this lawsuit to make it harder to vote. But Paige, once again, we have seen the courts be the ones who have stood up and have rejected these efforts to make it harder for people to be able to cast their ballots.
Today's decision by the Wisconsin Supreme Court actually dismisses the lawsuit entirely, finding that the right-wing group did not have standing to sue. They did not issue a ruling on the merits of the case. They did not say whether or not the van itself was legal. However, what this means is that moving forward, cities in Wisconsin can continue to establish in-person absentee voting sites without any new restrictions. Now in Wisconsin, an in-person absentee voting sites allows voters to request, fill out, and submit an absentee ballot all on the spot with the help of election officials.
Yeah, and I think we'd be remiss if we don't point out that this case is now the fourth voting case in a row where the Wisconsin Supreme Court has rejected efforts to restrict voting and has expanded it. It restored drop boxes in a lawsuit that was also brought by my law firm. It struck down the state's legislative map as violating the state constitution because it was a political partisan gerrymander. And that led to a redrawn map that is much more balanced now. And you see the effects that it's had in the legislature. And of course, just recently, Democracy Docket reported on a case where there was an effort by the Republican legislature to fire the nonpartisan head staff member of the Wisconsin Election Commission, and that was rejected. So, you know, a number of these cases have been decided by very narrow margins, 4-3. The one involving the staff member, as I recall, was either a unanimous decision or a much wider margin. But Paige, it goes to show that in states that have elections for their state Supreme Court, those elections matter. You know, we've talked a lot about the election in North Carolina where Republicans are trying to steal a state Supreme Court race there. But Paige, there's a lot that's been going on over the years in these elections in Wisconsin as well.
Right, Marc, the four cases you just mentioned were all decided by the liberal majority of the Wisconsin Supreme Court since the election of Janet Protasiewicz in 2023. Now, we say liberal majority in Wisconsin because Wisconsin doesn't have partisan state Supreme Court races the way North Carolina does. Candidates aren't running with a declared party affiliation. However, they have their own political sways, their own line of thinking and ideologies, which makes justices liberal or conservative. And there's now currently a liberal majority on the court. But there's another important race coming up for the Wisconsin Supreme Court this spring.
Yeah, and Paige, there's a lot of attention being paid on this Wisconsin state Supreme Court election. I noticed recently a story that even Elon Musk, who either does run Doge or doesn't run Doge, or maybe doesn't know anything about Doge, who knows, depending on the day, we get different information out of the Trump White House, but that he may be funding some activity there. And this is an election that's going to attract national attention because the gap between the liberal justices and the conservative justices in Wisconsin is as wide as really in any state. I mean, there are states where the state Supreme Courts, even where they have partisan elections, can be fairly, you can see a lot of mixing up of who's on which side of the opinions. That really isn't true in Wisconsin. There is a very, very conservative block on this state Supreme Court that has been hostile to voting rights, has been hostile to other rights as well. But it goes to show, Paige, that it is not just the elections that are held, in the even numbered years or even in November that matter a lot for democracy.
Right, this Wisconsin Supreme Court election is scheduled for April 1st. Liberal Justice Ann Walsh Bradley is retiring. Liberal Dane County Circuit Court Judge Susan Crawford and conservative Waukesha County Circuit Judge Brad Schmiel are vying to replace Bradley on the court. And like you said, this is a major election because it is a 4-3 court right now. Whoever wins will determine ideological control of the court. And Marc, we should know that just because someone may be liberal or conservative doesn't always mean that they rule that way 100% of the time. But when it comes to issues like voting, like abortion, like labor rights, the ideological makeup on a court can really make the difference between someone being able to exercise their rights freely or have limited access.
Yeah, let's just take the issue of ballot drop boxes. Ballot drop boxes are a lifeline to many voters who need to vote by mail or vote absentee, right? They may not have, regular access to mail service, or they may just not trust it. They may think it takes too long. And ballot drop boxes are a secure way for people to return their ballot. Well, when there was a conservative state Supreme Court, ballot drop boxes were banned. And now, as the result of a more recent decision with a liberal majority state Supreme Court, ballot drop boxes were in place. And so they were in place for the 2024 election. Now, I'm not going to say that they were outcome determinative of that election. Who knows? You can never know what the thing is that mattered or didn't matter. But I can tell you this, there were individual voters who, regardless of who they voted for, whether they voted for Donald Trump or they voted for Kamala Harris, whether they voted for Tammy Baldwin or Eric Hovde, their ability to cast a ballot, to participate in the election at all, was as a result of that court decision. So don't think that these rules don't matter. If they didn't matter, the Republican National Committee wouldn't be investing so much money and energy into them. If these rules didn't matter, you wouldn't see Donald Trump constantly requiring loyalty oaths for people around being election deniers and vote suppressors. And if they didn't matter, you wouldn't have a block of conservative justices on this court and others who routinely voted against them. So these were big practical decisions that were impactful to voters and maybe the outcome of the election in 2024. But Paige, this also ties in with the increased role that we see from state Supreme Courts. We've talked in other episodes, and Democracy Docket's covered the fringe independent state legislature theory, which is to strip state courts of their ability to rule in a lot of these voting cases. Now, that's failed so far, right? Republicans have not been able to do that. You and I recently published a video about how the Republicans in Pennsylvania are trying to get the U.S. Supreme Court to take a case to reverse something in that state Supreme Court. So again, if these cases didn't matter, if these state Supreme Court elections weren't that important, you wouldn't be seeing all of these efforts to try to influence these state Supreme Court elections. You wouldn't see Elon Musk's interest, you wouldn't see Republicans trying to strip the power of state Supreme Courts through fringe theories.
And Democracy Docket is tracking 5 other lawsuits filed in Wisconsin state courts related to voting rights. Now, these lawsuits cover a wide variety of topics. They deal with the state's involvement in ERIC, a multi-state organization that helps states maintain voter rolls. It involves voter roll maintenance itself and whether or not Wisconsin accurately checks for citizenship when they're registering people to vote. It deals with absentee ballots and witness certificates. So there's a lot of opportunities for lawsuits to come before the state Supreme Court before the next major election that could dramatically change how people in Wisconsin register to vote and cast their ballot.
Yeah, and that's a really, really important point because, election litigation, voting litigation doesn't begin, 5 months before an election and, the day after the election. That lawsuit that victory we're celebrating now, that lawsuit was filed in 2022. And now here we are in 2025, and a big victory. So we ought to savor this victory. Like, I don't want people to feel like, oh my God, they're already on to the next thing. So take a deep breath. Everybody, you can, if you're alone, you can shout out hooray, all together, hooray, right? Because this was a big victory for voters and for voting rights. But democracy is on the docket. Like, democracy is still being fought out in courthouses around this country by Republican vote suppressors and their allies trying to make it harder to vote, Republican election deniers trying to make it easier to cheat, and by voting rights lawyers and advocates. My law firm was involved in this case, and I'm proud of them. But there are lots of law firms and advocates out there fighting every single day to make sure that we maintain free and fair elections. And it's really important that people, celebrate these wins, but also remember that this fight continues. And the way you're going to stay informed about that fight and know where it's happening and what's important is by subscribing to Democracy Docket. So please take a second, click on the link above. You'll get accurate, timely information about what is happening to democracy in court, and we will see you next time.